Chapter 38. A nice bit of action, a nice bit of description. The chapter was about a journey that took all night. When Edward left the hut with the Highlanders, the sun had just gone down. The hovel is clearly in a ravine next to this brook that was described in the last chapter. It's obviously like a very narrow chasm, very heavily wooded, completely hidden from even the track that runs along the side of the ravine that's basically just 15-20 metres away, it seems. The group of Highlanders go single file up some tiny little track up to the top of the ravine, and they hide in the trees at the top. And Edward hears an English sentry. He's calling all's well, and the call sort of goes down a line, and somebody else takes it up and calls all's well a bit further along, and then somebody else. Obviously, there are British sentries here at sentry posts all the way along the path. And it's quite clear that the Highlanders need to sneak past them. There's one Highlander in the lead, and he's given a name, Donald Durock. Edward thinks he recognises him as Donald the Bandit's chief man, but he's not quite sure. Donald is shown to be able to move very silently, and he obviously knows the area around them very well. He's quite a skilled woodsman. He's written up quite well. They sneak down this path for some time. We're not really sure it's a path. Edward can't really see anything. It's very dark. Donald Durock gives him a weapon. It's a sword of some sort, and makes him understand by hand gestures that he might have to use it and that they need to be very quiet. Edward obeys this. In some places, Donald Durock actually goes down on hands and knees and apparently is almost indistinguishable from the heath that they're crawling through. He gets Edward and the people behind them to do the same. They reach one point where he tells all the rest to go away so that there's only 3 of them, him and Edward and one other. And they have a little bit of adventure with some sentries. They find some British soldiers asleep around a campfire and one on guard. There's some more very nice description, rather Tolkien-esque in a way. An outpost of 4 or 5 soldiers lying by their watchfire. They were all asleep except the sentinel, who paced backwards and forwards with his firelock on his shoulder, which glanced red in the light of the fire as he crossed and recrossed before it in his short walk, casting his eye frequently to that part of the heavens from which the moon, hitherto obscured by mist, seemed now about to make her appearance. Edward and the Highlanders lie in the shadows for a little while and watch these guys. It's quite obvious they have to get past them. It's quite obvious that it's just open ground on the other side of them, and if the moon does come out, these soldiers are going to see them, and they don't want that. And then, of course, the moon does come out. Donald Durock acts as decoy. It's a nice trick. I think they were very lucky. It would only have taken the soldiers to look around once in the other direction, but apparently they don't. They just chase off after Donald, just assuming that he is alone, and he makes sure he shows himself every so often, so they do follow him. So the other man and Edward run for about a quarter of a mile across this open ground. When they had walked about half an hour, still along open and waste ground of the same description, they came to the stump of an ancient oak, which from its relics appeared to have been at one time a tree of very large size. In an adjacent hollow they found several Highlanders with a horse or 2, and this is where Donald Durock rejoins them as well. From this point Edward rides. He's very pleased to do this because he was very fevered and sick, and he's still a bit injured, and he's getting very fatigued after the night's run. No other incident marked the course of that night's journey, and at the dawn of morning they attained the banks of a rapid river. The country around was at once fertile and romantic. Steep banks of wood were broken by cornfields, which this year presented an abundant harvest, already in a great measure cut down. On the opposite bank of the river, and partly surrounded by a winding of its stream, stood a large and massive castle, the half-ruined turrets of which were already glittering in the first rays of the sun. It was in form an oblong square, of size sufficient to contain a large court in the centre. The towers at each angle of the square rose higher than the walls of the building, and were, in their turn, surmounted by turrets, differing in height and irregular in shape. Upon one of these a sentinel watched, whose bonnet and plaid streaming in the wind declared him to be a Highlander, as a broad white ensign which floated from another tower announced that the garrison was held by the insurgent adherents of the House of Stuart. They go through a little town and into this castle. A gentleman dressed in the Highland garb, having a white cockade in his bonnet, assisted Waverley to dismount from his horse, and with much courtesy bid him welcome to the castle. Waverley was taken to a bedroom, a half-ruinous apartment, where there was a small camp bed, was offered refreshment. Waverley thanks him very politely, asks if he's a prisoner. The man who took him there said he's not at liberty to explain anything. But, he said, you are in the castle of Doune, or is it Down, D-O-U-N-E, I don't know how that's pronounced, in the district of Monteith, and in no danger whatsoever, which is good news. The man then leaves, and Edward is alone in this apartment. Exhausted by the fatigues of the night, our hero now threw himself upon the bed and was in a few minutes fast asleep. It's a whole chapter where the only talk comes right at the end. They're just sneaking silently through the night. And because it's night, Edward isn't saying much. In a way, that's a good thing, because otherwise we might have a huge amount of description. We've already got a fair bit of description in this, even though he can't see anything. It's action of a sort. I do like these Highlanders. The way they're described was kind of impressive. The way Donald Duroc was able to sneak about, and the way he could sort of like sniff the air and smell smoke much sooner than Edward could smell it. The way he could move very silently and I presume isn't even leaving any tracks in the ground. He's an impressive sort of character. It doesn't in some ways feel like a full chapter though, because we didn't really have that engagement with Edward himself. We weren't in his mind, so we don't really, I mean we were, but if that's his mind, that's a pretty blank mind. He was just, we were looking through his eyes, but we weren't in his mind. So we didn't know what he was thinking, we didn't know, we sort of knew what he was feeling, we knew he was fatigued, but that sort of made it less satisfying than it otherwise could have been. But maybe the next chapter will explain anything, so I'll get on with that one. Chapter 39. We're getting to some real story. This was a great chapter. We've actually got a little bit of war going on, and I really like that. I don't read war stories, so I didn't know how I'd feel about it when we got to battles. I guess this isn't a war story as such. It is, but it's like a historical war story told by somebody who likes to pull out the more dramatic elements of it. Edward finally is feeling like there is a war starting to happen around him. He woke up late in the morning. This has happened so many times before that he gets somewhere, he's really tired, and the chapter ends with him falling asleep, and then the next chapter starts with him waking late and alone. This happened again. I was pretty well expecting him to wake up, leave this room, and come across a girl, because that's happened so many times before, that he would find a girl and she'd sing him a song. But no, it didn't. So he woke up late, and a servant brought him his food. He has a late breakfast in this ruinous apartment that he slept in. And he's wondering what to do. He learns from the servant that he's going to be moving on at night. He's only there for the day. When the sun goes down, they're going to travel again. In the meantime, he has to stay where he is. He is still not sure, is he a prisoner, or are they just keeping him here because it's actually dangerous for him to go out and they're actually his friends? Nobody will talk to him. He asks a million questions of this servant who said the bit that he said at the start and doesn't say any more and goes out. So Edward is sitting there feeling kind of alone and doesn't have any ideas on how to find out what's going on when he remembers Alice and how she put some packet of papers in his portmanteau. He's got his portmanteau here, so he's just decided to go and look in the portmanteau because maybe the papers that Alice put in there are going to explain everything. But when he gets up to do that, the servant comes back in and picks up his portmanteau. Edward tries to stop him from taking it by saying, "I'd like to put on some clean linen." The servant says, "I need to take the portmanteau. It's going on the baggage cart. If you need clean linen, the governor of the castle will give it to you." So the servant takes the portmanteau and Edward waits for 5 more hours with absolutely nothing to do. In the evening he has a meal with the man who met him the night before, who is the governor of the castle, who is called Colonel Stewart. Colonel Stewart also won't tell him anything. He says he can't. It's not his place to say a word about it. But he treats him very well and they have a good meal and they part kind of friends, enemy friends. Edward just doesn't know. It's an amicable parting. He goes out to the courtyard where there is a horse waiting for him. He mounts and he is joined by a troop. It's kind of a troop like Gilfillan's troop. It's like a bunch of soldiers. They're wearing colours, but they're not wearing complete uniform. They're obviously a Stuart army. They're even more obviously not trained soldiers. They're sort of capable riders and they've got weapons. They're recruits collected from sort of neighbouring grounds. He doesn't really know much about them, but their commander is Bally, who I didn't expect. That came as a surprise to me. Edward was thinking maybe Bally would tell him what's going on, but Bally actually pretends he doesn't know him and won't speak to him because Scott tells us Bally still remembers how he was defeated by Tully in that duel right back at the start. And he's still embarrassed by that. That happened because of Edward, and Bally hasn't forgiven Edward for it. So Bally won't speak to Edward. He just ignores him. And he doesn't go anywhere near him, so Edward can't talk to him. They set off. There are a few other people here that Scott mentions. One of them is the quartermaster, who actually does talk to Edward for a while. Edward is finally learning the way to talk to people. He's not just asking what he wants to know and pushing the point when it's obvious that they don't want to tell him. He's actually being polite and he's actually going about it in something of a roundabout way, and he's getting this fellow to talk about what he's interested in, which is horses. And he says, "Where are we going?" And the fellow says, "On a fool's errand." And he says, "You don't seem like a fool, so why would you be here if this was a fool's errand?" And the fellow says, "Well, these are all my horses, 30 horses. I've sold them to Bally because he wanted them for his troop, but turns out he can't pay for them yet, so I'm staying with him to make sure that I get either the money for the horses or I'll take the horses back." After he said this much, Bally comes back and says to him quite sternly that they were all ordered not to speak to the prisoner and he needs to remember it, which is useful information because now we know that Edward is in fact a prisoner. Something that didn't come out until a later chapter is Edward actually noticed that Bally didn't have much control over his troops. This was indicated by the quartermaster talking to Edward, especially after Bally made it clear that he'd given orders that nobody was to speak to the prisoner. But not only was it that the quartermaster actually talked to him, but it was the things the quartermaster told him that were not very complimentary of Bally at all. We were also apparently supposed to learn from this chapter, and it went straight over my head because I don't know this era very well, that Bally's men were basically conscripted into this. There was a mention in the chapter of one other in the group who was there simply because the lease was up on his farm, and it seemed like Bally refused to renew anybody's leases unless they joined the army, which is something I mentioned in my video about the history behind Waverley, that did happen, that the fate of a tenant on a property was very much tied up in the political leanings and successes or failures of the master of the property. But what Edward obviously took away from this, although Scott didn't put us in his head enough for us to realise this, was that Bally had basically overstretched himself just to get together 30 men. He'd got them there through a mix of bribery and compulsion. It becomes clear later on that Edward recognises this is no way to lead a troop, that you haven't really got that troop at your back if they're there under those conditions. It's a real shame we didn't know this I would have viewed Edward differently in this chapter if I'd known he was sitting there quietly doing this kind of assessing of the people around him, if I knew that he understood this much about the circumstances around him, because he never seems to. I'm thinking Scott actually has more respect for Edward than we do, and probably presumed that this was how we were going to view him, whereas I'm still highly sceptical of his abilities, of his capabilities. But if that's what Edward really was thinking here, and it looks later on as if it was, then they were good thoughts to be having. There's more to the lad than we know. They travel along, they get to Stirling. So they're obviously going the same way that they were taking Edward before. They don't go to Stirling, but they come sort of near the castle. The road goes around the outside of it, it seems. So they're travelling along the road on the outside of it, with all the people in the castle watching them, and the castle is flying the Union flag. And Bally orders his trumpeter to trumpet, I'm not sure what it's called, the bits of songs that they do when they're in a troop, and it seems like they've got different ones. So there's one that the Stuart soldiers use, and there's a different one that the Union soldiers use, the Union soldiers being the soldiers of George II. So he gets his trumpeter to trumpet like the Stuart bugle playing, upon which the castle fires on them. They shoot a cannon, and the cannon shot lands fairly close to them, actually misses them, but lands fairly close to them. They obviously didn't expect this, and when this happens, most of the troop just break into a gallop and basically run away. They just gallop down the road until they're so far out of range that they know that nobody's going to shoot them. Scott tells us that, to his credit, Bally did actually stay at the rear and did return fire at least once, and he tried to keep his men together, but they're not really trained soldiers and they're not very disciplined. Out of danger, they slow down again to a trot and just carry on. Edward is sort of watching the soldiers. He's noticing that although they're sort of fairly capable at what they're doing, they lack the polish of soldiers, and he can see the difference now. He can see the horses haven't been trained to walk and trot in time the way soldiers' horses have, and they don't know the formations, and they also haven't been trained to the use of a rider with a rifle. So it seems he did pick up some things in his time with the regiment. Because no one will talk to him, this is sort of how he's entertaining himself as he goes along. He's just watching them all and sort of thinking about that and assessing their abilities as soldiers and what he would have done had they been the soldiers in his own regiment when he was a captain, which is something I wish he'd done more of in the last chapter. This is good. This is the sort of being in Edward's head that I really wanted. So I'm very pleased to see it here. After a while, after half a day I presume, they're on the outskirts of Edinburgh. Now, I did not know they were going to Edinburgh. This is, I guess, a small point. Perhaps if I looked at a map of Scotland, travelling from that castle to Stirling, maybe I could have deduced it. I don't know if Edward knew it. I don't know if he understands the geography of Scotland. I presume he does, because he was heading for Edinburgh himself. And when they top the rise and there's Edinburgh below them, it's under fire. There is a lot of cannon fire, and this is where we get sort of real war happening, which is rather cool. It seems that the Union soldiers are pretty much in control of Edinburgh, but at this point it's got both camps there. So it's got the Union soldiers and it's got the Stuart soldiers, and just behind the castle of Edinburgh there is a place called Holyrood. Now, I actually don't know. I don't know my Scottish stuff. I don't know if this is actually the castle of Edinburgh or if this is a different castle or what it is. But Holyrood is the Stuart headquarters, and this is where Bally has brought his troop and they have brought Edward. When they arrive, they hand Edward over to some sentries at Holyrood, and Edward is taken inside. How it phrases it here is that Bally, in charge of his troop, left the direct road and, sweeping considerably to the southward so as to keep out of the range of the cannon, approached the ancient palace of Holyrood without having entered the walls of the city. He then drew up his men in front of that venerable pile and delivered Waverley to the custody of a guard of Highlanders, whose officer conducted him into the interior of this building. A long, low and ill-proportioned gallery hung with pictures affirmed to be the portraits of kings who, if they ever flourished at all, lived several hundred years before the invention of painting in oil colours, served as a sort of guard chamber or vestibule to the apartments which the adventurous Charles Edward now occupied in the palace of his ancestors. Officers both in the Highland and Lowland garb passed and repassed in haste, or loitered in the hall as if waiting for orders. Secretaries were engaged in making out passes, musters, and returns. All seemed busy and earnestly intent upon something of importance, but Waverley was suffered to remain seated in the recess of a window unnoticed by anyone, in anxious reflection upon the crisis of his fate, which seemed now rapidly approaching. I'm not sure what I like most. It had a bit of action, it had a little bit of the motivations of the people involved. The other thing is, I like the way it ended. It ended with us knowing where he was. He wasn't some strange place where he didn't really know what was going on. He's not going to bed without a single question answered, which is the usual system for these chapters. He knows he is in the headquarters of Charles Stuart. He doesn't know why, but he knows where he is, and we, the reader, have some idea of what to expect. And my battery's going flat, so I'll leave it there. Chapter 40. Work was hard this week, and I've been a little bit unwell, so I'm slightly behind. Hopefully not too far. I think this one will still go up when I intended it to. But it's been a couple of days since I read the last chapters. I have remembered though. So chapter 40. At the start of this chapter, Edward is sitting alone in Holyrood Palace, watching people coming and going, when he hears the rustle of tartan behind him. Which makes me wonder what tartan really sounds like. I guess it's a sort of wool, isn't it? So it probably does have a rustle, but I hadn't kind of imagined that. Someone puts their hand on his shoulder, he turns around, and it's Fergus. Fergus seems very happy to see him. Edward is equally happy to see Fergus, and the first thing Edward says is, "How wonderful to see you, where's Flora?" Fergus says Flora is actually in this city. She's not in Holyrood Palace, but she's in the city, and in due course he'll take Edward to see her. In the meantime, he says, there's someone else here who has been asking after you quite often. Come with me now. Edward follows Fergus into what they call a presence room, fitted up with some attempt at royal state. And here he meets Prince Charles Edward, a young man wearing his own fair hair, distinguished by the dignity of his mien and the noble expression of his well-formed and regular features. In his easy and graceful manners, Waverley afterwards thought he could have discovered his high birth and rank. Fergus says, "Let me present to your Royal Highness." Prince Charles Edward interrupts him and says, "The descendant of one of the most ancient and loyal families in England." He extended his hand to Edward with utmost courtesy. Edward could not, had he desired it, have avoided rendering him the homage which seemed due to his rank. They have a little bit of conversation. The prince explains that although Edward was something of a prisoner on this journey in, it was only because they weren't sure of his allegiance. And the prince also says, if you are loyal to the Union, then you may go join them. I won't stop you. There'll be no penalty. If you choose to stay here with me, that would be wonderful. But I only want people who genuinely wish to do that. So Edward kind of instantly goes down on his knee and swears fealty to the prince. Should I or should I not here point out similarities that I see with Merry and Pippin doing something quite similar with various kings in Lord of the Rings? The similarity is there. I don't need to go into that. It's there. The prince is very pleased with this, and the prince gives him a sword, which has been in his own family for some generations. Admittedly, he doesn't actually have a name for this sword, but he does say it will serve him well and that it's something of an heirloom and how it was made. I see parallels here too. I feel like Tolkien has just taken some of these scenes and like improved on them brilliantly. But you know, in embryo, they're here in Waverley. The sun has nearly gone down and the light is changing a lot in here, and now I'm having trouble seeing. But I want to get this finished, so I'll carry on if I can see the book at all. There's a lot of description of this prince. Well, once again, it's not really description of this prince so much as just telling us how noble and fair and elegant and everything he is. He's older than Edward. I think Edward is sort of 18. Maybe he's heading on to 19 because he's been up in Scotland for months now. And the prince is 25, but they're both young men. Now, there's a little bit here about Fergus and how Fergus was so politic in greeting Edward the way he did and then taking him to see the prince, because Fergus always did want Edward to swear fealty to this side. As we said earlier, he's hoping for an earldom, and bringing the Waverleys to the cause of Prince Charles Edward is very likely to get him that earldom, because if the Waverleys are confirmed on the side of Charles Edward, then chances are other English gentlemen will follow, because this was a big concern that they had, that Scott sort of touches on in this chapter. The English Jacobites these days are more Jacobite in name and nostalgia, but not in action. So if the Waverleys are confirmed for Charles Edward, then who knows what other English families might follow suit. Prince Charles offers Edward a rank, brevet major, but Edward turns it down. He says, I'd rather just serve under Fergus for now until people can see what I can do and actually want to follow me, which is kind of cool that he did that, I think. The prince is quite pleased with this, and this is the point at which he actually gives him the sword, because he says, well, if you won't let me give you a rank, at least let me arm you. And that's sort of a cool thing that he's done, giving his own sword, because he unbuckled it from his own side and gave it to Edward. So after this, I'm sorry about this, I've got this TV on and it wasn't really noticeable when there was sun coming in, but now that the sun's almost gone down, there's a variety of different colours over there to my right. But I'm going to push on. After this, Edward is introduced to various chieftains that are in the room, various men belonging to Charles. And Charles says that he and 7 others landed on the coast. They didn't come with a big army, it was just a small shipload of them. They met the chieftains and they've headed down this way. Now, something a few chapters ago that I didn't mention, when Edward was taken prisoner by, what was that man's name? Major Melville. Major Melville and Mr. Morton the Reverend, when they had that meal at night, when Edward was shut up in his room, one thing that Major Melville told the Reverend was that a military officer for the Union, he had troops, he was coming into the lowlands, and he changed his mind and took the troops to the highlands instead, or took the troops further north, I gather. Major Melville felt that was a very bad move, and that was what left the lowlands unprotected. I did mention that Mr. Morton hadn't realised how undefended the lowlands were and what their danger was, and that was why Edward couldn't be kept at Major Melville's house. It was because this Union general had taken his men away from the lowlands and he was supposed to stop Charles from getting through. Now, because he did this, Prince Charles and the chieftains were able to move through the lowlands and reach Edinburgh, and that is why there is this battle going on in Edinburgh at the moment. So it's only just happened. They've only just arrived. Pretty much at the same time as Edward was on the move, these guys were on the move. They came through probably when Edward was healing in the little hut in the ravine. They did very well because this general went the wrong way. This Union general from England did this dumb thing. But the prince knows that that's not an indication of British forces. He knows that they just got really lucky. And so now he and the chieftains are working out what to do next. They have two options. They could return to the Highlands and strengthen their position and wait for troops to join them from France, and then hopefully continue to recruit soldiers and build up their forces until they're strong enough to properly attack. Or they could stay where they are and try to hold Edinburgh, at least try to take all of Edinburgh and hold onto Holyrood Palace. Charles's advisors are divided on this question. Some think that they're just going to lose everything if they stay there. They have to go back into the Highlands and build up their forces. But others think that if they do that, they're going to look like cowards, and all the support that they've got now will probably drop away, and they lose any chance of gaining more support, particularly from England. So in this chapter, nearly at the end, Charles asks Edward what he thinks. Edward says he doesn't know what Charles's military strength currently is, and because of that, there's no way he could possibly judge, which is actually a very good answer. But he says he would love the opportunity to fight on Charles's behalf and stay in Edinburgh. It's a good answer. Charles likes his answer, and at the end of the chapter, Charles shakes his hand heartily and tells Fergus to go get him properly equipped. We have another change of fortunes for Edward. He has taken a side. He has made a decision. It's not something that he's just drifted into because it's around him. He has actively chosen to be a supporter of Charles Edward. He put as little thought into this as he does into everything. This is true. He really just did it because he was so happy to see Fergus after being prisoner for so long, and he was kind of blown away by the fact that a prince of the realm was treating him in this way. And Scott does tell us that Fergus did make some very calls there and kind of knew how that would come across. Fergus isn't a smooth talker. He's aware of this himself, and he knew that Edward would need to hear something like that because Edward is a very refined English gentleman, and he knew that it was going to take somebody with a lot more eloquence and finesse to convince Edward. He obviously realises what sort of things will convince Edward. It's not reason that is going to impress Edward the most. It is the romance, it is the appearance, the drama, the magnificence even. It's all of those things that will count with Edward, and Fergus does seem to have realised this, so he did the best things he could. But Scott also tells us that Fergus does actually like Edward, and Edward actually likes Fergus. They are friends, and the things that they each like don't get in each other's ways. And that's interesting. That is how Scott phrases it. They don't obstruct each other with their interests and their opinions and their decisions. And so I think it was quite a good chapter. I didn't like the little bits about the prince, which were very common for that age, that the prince is described as, I don't know, very loftily, but that made sense. I mean, that's how royalty was considered by everybody, and many people didn't actually get to meet them ever in their life. Those that did, there had to be that distance, there had to be that elevation with the royal family. They weren't just people like you and I, they were just something up above. And in these days, where part of what they're fighting about is the right of kings, if you're going to accept the notion of a divine right, which is the Stuarts' claim to legitimacy as rulers, then I guess they have to be, don't they? They have to be somehow elevated. They can't be like the rest of us because God has divinely appointed them to lead the country, to rule the country. So they've got to be different. They've got to be grander and more, I don't know, special in various ways. And so it does make sense that Scott will describe him such. Now, the other thing that Scott does say in this chapter when he calls him the prince, and he says that from now on he will call him the prince because had matters turned out differently, this would be his title in England. So he sort of makes it clear that he's not necessarily saying that Charles Edward is the rightful Prince of England, but for the purposes of this story, since we're going to be in his presence, this is what we will call him. I sort of like that too. I guess he still had to be fairly careful. He didn't want to say anything treasonous for his own country. It's interesting that he's touched on this subject and taken such a sympathetic look at the Jacobite side, which was the enemy of England's side. Therefore, to call Charles Edward the king is treasonous, really, even from a distance of 60 years. But he's fairly carefully placed this waiver into it all. We're going to call him the prince because that's how these people see him. That, I think, is all I can say about this chapter. It was only a couple of pages and I've pulled all that out of it already. So I'll go on.